This video was brought to you by Brilliant. We've made a number of videos about the demographic crises present in countries like Russia, China, and Japan. But these aren't the only countries facing falling birth rates and shrinking populations. In fact, it's a trend that can be seen around the world. So in this video, we're going to go through the global numbers and explore whether or not this is something to worry about. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. On a global scale, the population is still rising and will continue to do so for some time. According to UN estimates, the world reached 8 billion people in November of 2022 and is expected to hit 9 billion by 2037. It's then expected to reach a peak of about 10.4 billion in the 2080s, then plateau and begin to slowly fall by 2100. This growth over the coming decades is forecast despite the fact that global fertility rate will continue to fall from 2.3 births per woman today to an expected 2.1 by 2050. Now, that's thanks to the momentum of past growth embedded in the youthful age structure of the current population, with the UN saying that 2/3 of the projected rise in global population through 2050 will be driven by this population momentum. Falling fertility rates and shrinking populations are a phenomena occurring across the world, but the situation is particularly acute in places like China, Japan, and South Korea. In 2022, China, the world's most populous country, recorded its first population decline in more than 60 years. And the country is expected to see its population plunge from about 1.4 billion to below 800 million by 2100. Meanwhile, Japan's population has been declining for years and is forecast to shrink from 125 million to 87 million by 2070. South Korea, meanwhile, has the lowest fertility rate in the world at 0.78 in 2022, making it the only OECD country with a rate lower than 1. That's really significant, because a fertility rate of around 2.1 births per woman is generally considered to be the replacement rate, or in other words, enough to maintain a stable population. So they are significantly below that threshold. Regardless, things aren't all that much better in other advanced economies around the world either. According to the World Bank, all OECD countries except Israel have fertility rates lower than the replacement rate. And there are some 61 countries around the world that are expected to see their populations shrink by 2050. Now, the product of these low fertility rates, coupled with rising life expectancy, is an aging population. In other words, the proportion of older people in a population grows while the proportion of working age and young people shrinks. Now, aging populations can be found all over the world, not just in places like Japan, the UK, and the US, but also in Italy and basically the entirety of the EU, Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, China, and more. In fact, the only place bucking the trend is Africa, which is forecast to see significant growth in the coming decades. In fact, more than half of the global population growth between now and 2050 is expected to occur in Africa. But even though Africa will experience a huge growth, the forecasts for the continent are lower than they were a decade ago, as fertility rates fall faster than once expected. In fact, the UN has, in the past few years, revised down its population growth forecasts for not just Africa, but the entire world. So, is this something we should worry about? Well, shrinking and aging populations on both a country level and a global scale do pose a number of problems. Less people of working age means that labour demand will go unmet, which is not good for productivity or economic growth. At the same time, you have a growing elderly population that requires more and more spending on things like social security and healthcare, all while the pool of people to actually care for them gets smaller and smaller. As the proportion of working-age people relative to pensioners shifts further, governments will likely feel the need to tax workers more in order to maintain public services, especially health and social care. But it is worth pointing out that there are some positive things to reflect on when looking at these trends. For instance, lifespans are continuing to grow, thanks to improvements in medicine, care, and lifestyle, meaning that much of the elderly population are enjoying longer and healthier lives. Not only that, but the decline in fertility rates from 5 births per woman in 1950 to 2.3 per woman today can largely be attributed to economic development, improvement in quality of life, and the greater control that individuals, particularly women, are able to exercise over their reproductive lives. Nonetheless, demographic shifts like the ones taking place, or forecast to take place, do need government attention. No one's going to argue that the solution to an aging population is to reduce life expectancy. So that basically leaves two approaches. The first being migration, the second being policies which boost fertility rates. On a country level, migration does help to sustain population growth, increase the working age population, and help to fulfill demand for labor. But migration obviously has its limits if aging populations are a global phenomenon, as one country topping up its working age population through migration might come at the expense of another. In fact, many countries currently experiencing population decline, especially in Eastern and Southern Europe, are doing so because much of their young population is emigrating. As such, many countries look to boost their fertility rates instead, in the hopes of turning around the current demographic trend. However, the UN has suggested that governments should be cautious in any attempts to try and push up fertility rates, so that some kind of optimal birth rate and population can be met. Instead, they say that policies should try and close the gap between the current fertility rate and the number of children that people actually want. In some countries, mostly poorer ones, a large proportion of women actually have more children than they would like. So improving things like healthcare, family planning, and bodily autonomy can help parents achieve their preferred outcome. Elsewhere, though, parents have less children than they like. So policy should probably focus on making it more affordable to raise a child and address the concerns of potential parents that their careers might take a hit. The reality, though, is that pro-natalist policies in places like Singapore, Japan, and Italy have so far proven to be pretty ineffective, suggesting that as we look ahead to the next century, the world really does need to start preparing for a new demographic reality. The wider question to consider, though, is what's the ideal population size? Or perhaps more importantly, does such a thing exist? Some argue that the status quo should be maintained. Others say a decline in population would actually be good in order to reduce consumption and the impact of human activity on the environment. And finally, plenty of people make the case that we need to boost our population in order to meet our labor demands, ensure economic growth, and more. It's interesting that even as people ostensibly into politics, the TLDR team spends more and more time analysing data and economic information as it becomes more and more critical to our lives. And as a bunch of people who are ordinarily more focused on words than numbers, we've really benefited from the courses on brilliant.org in order to keep ourselves sharp. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. From foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Even if, like us, you don't think of yourself as a traditionally STEM kind of person, these courses could prove incredibly useful for your life and career. Courses like data analysis and the fundamentals of statistics can help anyone ensure that they're properly understanding our increasingly data-driven world, which is good news when your boss suddenly asks you to analyze a trade war, an economy, or the collapse of a currency. You know, just hypothetically. Anyway, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by clicking the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you to sign up will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.